Today we're gonna go through the Battle of Midway. So the first thing we're gonna discuss is why was Midway strategically important for the Japanese, and why was it important for the Americans? Stefano?
Okay, so the Battle of Midway was an opening door for both sides. So whoever would win at Midway would basically have the road basically already set to advance on the other side of the Pacific. So for the Japanese, it was very important because if they would manage to win at Midway, they would not only destroy the American fleet, but they would also have access to new fortifications which they could convert, and this would allow them to bomb the American mainland without being without being attacked back. And for the Americans, it was very important because it could basically enable it would open the door for America to charge into and begin to close in on Japan. And for in regards to the battle tactics, Ray, would you kindly describe how the battle at sea and the battle at air differed and how?
Yeah, so Midway was an island, but none of the fighting ever happened on the island itself. It was mainly a battle at sea and a battle in the air. But due to the time frame in which this took place in 1942, the main form of naval battle was through aircraft carriers, and as a result of which, there wasn't really much of battling being done at sea. It was not an old school style where there would be gunships trying to shoot each other down. It was more aircraft carriers using their planes to take out the other aircraft carriers on the other side. Now, the US the US Navy at the time had three aircraft carriers, and those were the only three they had, or they had four, I believe, actually. And so those were the only four aircraft carriers they had, and that was essentially the entire US Navy, right? If the Japanese won at Midway and destroyed all four aircraft carrier, they would have effectively knocked the US out of the war, and they would be able not only to rampage through Southeast Asia, but perhaps even launch an amphibious attack closer to mainland US. But Japan, on the other side, came out with big guns. They also had four aircraft carrier, but they also had several gunships and warships in reserves. Now, the reserves was um, marshaled or whatever by Admiral Yamamoto, who was the number one in the Japanese Navy. And the number two, due to reasons of seniority rather than meritocracy, was Admiral Nagumo, who wasn't the most adept at modern naval warfare. He was a sort of admiral that was very by the book, and was he could never function out of order. So if something out of the blue happened, then all his plans would go to shame. Anyway, the the main strategy or tactics that was used by the Japanese, because they really initiated the battle, because they wanted to draw out the four American carriers and destroy them, was so what they did was initially use the airplanes to attack Midway and render the American base of Midway useless. So take out all of the planes um, from Midway, so that way when the American ships arrive, when the American aircraft carriers arrive, they do not have to face the dual threat of the the airplanes coming at them from the base and the airplanes coming at them from the aircraft carriers. However, that wasn't what happened, because um, the Americans had broken the code, and they did they already removed a majority of their airplanes, the bomber planes, which were the main target, and the Japanese kind of once again failed to achieve their primary purpose. And so the bomber planes were hidden in like a hangar or sort of thing, and then they came out and tried attacking Nagumo, but the Japanese planes were far too advanced, and the pilots were far more skilled as well. And so these big American bomber planes were kind of useless despite that fact. Once the battle actually began, it was just a volley sending planes from both sides, and it was using mainly like dive bombers or torpedo bombers. And so dive bombers would be planes that come down at hurtling speeds towards their target, drop a bomb, and then quickly turn back up. It's very skillful, very dangerous, but very accurate. And then there's torpedo bombers, who just they fly like around like sea level, I guess, and they drop a torpedo that goes underwater and then hits the hull of the ship. So those were the like two main types of battle that took place throughout. But what's also important is that the technologies used in the build up to the battle, and Stefano will take us through that.
Uh,
And so now we're going to talk about the technologies, which include aircraft carrier, radar, and code breaking. Stefano?
Okay, so these three technologies were essential for naval warfare in the Pacific. First of all, aircraft carriers were very, very effective and very, very efficient. This is because they basically enabled to, they were basically a moving aircraft strip on the ocean, and this was very effective. So if you think about it, planes need refueling. So if you're able to refuel planes in the middle of the ocean, this makes it very effective and much more effective than having to make your planes take off from mainland and then use enormous quantities of fuel to reach the enemy, fight, and then come back. This obviously is very inconvenient. But if you have an aircraft carrier, this is very effective as you can save fuel. You're much more mobile around the Pacific Ocean, and you're much more effective in the damage you can make as the aircraft do not need to refuel, are not limited in what they can do. A second technology that was also very important was radar. So if you're able to trace an enemy ship or enemy aircraft, this gives you time to get yourself prepared for the incoming attack. And this is obviously very effective, as if you can predict where your enemy is going to use your airplane against you or a vessel against you, you can prepare accordingly. One of the most, however, technologies that was found in the Pacific was code breaking, and this was also one of the main factors in the Battle of Midway. As you probably know, the Americans did get very lucky in discovering the Japanese code, and which led to them actually understanding where the Japanese would attack. So code breaking is important because if you're able to understand the intentions of the enemy, you're able to prepare accordingly once again. So if you know their strategic battle plan, you can create a counter plan which can basically be very effective in stopping it and defending yourself accordingly. And this was very effective for the Americans as they were able to crack the Japanese code, which basically did save their fate in a sense. In this case, it was Captain Joseph Rochefort, who was a naval intelligence officer and cryptanalyst, and he was able to understand the Japanese code. And despite not being believed initially, he did, in fact, prove that the code he had cracked was actually right. So decoding was another important factor. But now we should switch to the fourth question. So the reasons for the Japanese defeat and American victory, right? If you may go.
So when the battle commenced, any betting man, for example, would place all their money on Japan. They clearly had the superior aircraft carriers, the superior soldiers and pilots and naval officers, the superior planes. In general, they were far more experienced than in modern naval warfare than the Americans were. In fact, they expected it to be a swift and easy maneuver, taking out all four of the American aircraft carrier with this complex plan of first taking out the base and then luring the Americans to come in to the atoll at Midway and just ambush them, really. All of that fell apart immediately when Captain Rochefort cracked the code and gave it to Admiral Nimitz, who then promptly made sure that the planes from the base were hidden and then used to counterattack. And so the element of surprise flipped from Japan having the element of surprise to the US having the element of surprise. But as I said earlier, that initial element of surprise the US had, they kind of squandered it because of their incompetency to a certain extent. They couldn't make use of their bombers well enough, and the Japanese Zeros, which were these superior fighter jet planes, just absolutely annihilated the Americans. But one major reason for the Japanese defeat was indecisiveness in their leadership. As mentioned earlier, Admiral Nagumo was this sort of guy that was kind of at a loss for ideas and words whenever something out of plan happened, and the battle started off that way. It was not in the Japanese plan that their code was going to get cracked and decoded. So right off the bat, he was already on the back foot. And one thing to know with with airplanes on aircraft carriers is that they have to switch from ground attack weapons to naval attack weapons. To aerial, yeah, naval attack weapons. Basically, from like bombs, they can simply drop down to torpedoes or dive bombers, right? And Admiral Nagumo kept switching between the two because he wasn't sure where the next attack was going to come from. He wasn't sure whether to attack the island or whether to attack the oncoming American ships. But despite these inconsistencies, further, well, it's kind of debatable whether Japan was incompetent because of these inconsistencies or America was incompetent because of their lack of experience, so as to speak. But both the sides kind of had a lackluster start off to the war. They weren't quite sure what they were doing. Eventually, however, Japan did gain the upper hand, and they finally had, after much back and forth, they finally had all four aircraft carriers having weapons loaded on the airplanes to attack the American aircraft carriers, and there was clear sight. There was nothing that could stop them because the planes from the U.S. aircraft carriers already launched their attack and missed and failed quite badly. So now that the Japanese were staring at an open road and easy victory, so as to speak. But through some sheer force of luck or whatever one wants to call it, the there was an initial massive squad of American bomber planes, dive bomber planes, which were their only experienced pilots with some of their best dive bomber airplanes, so as to speak. They got lost, and because the initial attack from the U.S. aircraft carriers was so uncoordinated, this squadron kind of the largest squadron too kind of got lost in the vast expanse of the Pacific. However, just as Japan were looking forward or looking at this great like easy open road to victory and destroying all the American aircraft carriers, through some force of sheer luck, the lost American bomber squadrons happened to roll around right behind the the Japanese aircraft carriers, and from then on it was easy pickings for them because they were behind, they were significantly higher up. The Japanese airplanes didn't even know that they were there until they came hurtling down towards the aircraft carrier, dropped the bomb, and then quickly went back up. It was a complete decimation. All four um, Japanese aircraft carrier were destroyed, and Admiral Nagumo did manage to escape, and the reserve fleet kind of to rescue him and the other few top men, and he kind of lived to die another day, which he did very soon. But the shame that was brought on with this loss was never fully accepted in Japan. In Japan, they went back as heroes because everyone was scared to say they lost. Meanwhile, in the US, it was quite the opposite, and it was a sense of like we have finally joined the war. You know, we've made our presence felt. This was our first big naval battle in modern naval warfare, and we've had a resounding win. So those were kind of the reasons for Japanese loss and American victory. Could be argued the reasons Japanese lost was Admiral Nagumo's indecisiveness and incompetency, and kind of American luck really was how they won because they were flat on their backs the entire time. Right.
Uh, so
So let's discuss now, Stefano, why historians consider Midway to be like such a turning point in the Pacific. I feel like we've already mentioned it by answering the other four questions, but why don't you have a go first?
Okay, so if in Europe, Stalingrad was considered to be the first turning point of World War II, which saw an end to the German dominance in Europe. In the Pacific, we can say that Midway was, or historians say that Midway was the turning point, as it was the first major American victory in the Pacific. Up to that point, we must remember that America was being basically beaten the majority of the times. It was basically being flattened by the Japanese military superiority and superior experience. And after that point, it was quite grim for the Americans. The morale was at an all-time low, especially before the Battle of Midway. But after the Battle of Midway, which was, as Ray stated before, a combination of various factors of luck, of Japanese incompetency, and many other key points, the Americans had finally proved the point that they could fight in this Pacific scenario, and it was the first time the Americans had actually beaten the Japanese, despite obviously the luck and everything that has been stated before, on a fair one-on-one match without any obviously without any help. And so it was the first time that Japan had actually lost to America in a very decisive way. Ray, what do you think?
Well, yeah, something on the similar lines, really. I think one of the main reasons historians consider this like that absolute turning point was because it led to almost like mass destruction of aircraft carriers. It was going to lead to destruction of aircraft carriers on either side, which would kind of effectively knock the losing side out of the war in the Pacific theater. Everything that happened after uh, Midway 1942 for Japanese was kind of downhill from there, because they lost essentially half of their navy. Because at the time, gunships, warships, all of that didn't really matter as much if you had your aircraft carriers. You could have absolutely zero other ships and just a handful of quality aircraft carriers, and you were still in this. But when the Japanese had exactly half of their aircraft carriers taken out of the equation completely, that kind of put a massive dent in their plans because you need to understand that much of their goal was Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And if you don't have enough aircraft carriers to navigate and hop between islands and use these massive aircraft carriers as bases for your planes and attack and launch attacks, you're kind of useless in a war in the Pacific theater where much of the war involves a lot of naval battles. And the US, on the other hand, if they lost their four warships, that was it. They were done. They were dead. They were not going to be able to build more in time. They were not going to be able to kind of build enough in time because if the Japanese won from there, who knows what they could have done? They could have cemented their position at Midway, called maybe because they had a reserve fleet as well. They could have very easily launched another attack and perhaps taken Hawaii or something like that. There was a significant there's significant like importance on what happened at Midway. It's very important to understand that if the Americans lost, the Pacific could be looking very different than it is right now today. And I think that's why it was a turning point in the Pacific theater. It was like whoever wins this battle kind of don't want to say wins the Pacific theater because that's a big generalization, but like really whoever wins that battle has a very high chance of winning the Pacific theater because not only have they taken out the other side's aircraft carriers, but also huge amounts of confidence when you deplete your enemy's navy or you deplete half of your enemy's navy. I mean, that must be such an ego booster, especially for like the Japanese or the American soldiers that are there at the time, you know. So I think for those reasons, it's probably one of the most important battles in the Pacific.